The birth of a nightmare. How Freddy Krueger crawled into our dreams. In 1981, the LA Times ran an impossible story. Healthy young men were dying in their sleep. Doctors found nothing wrong with them. They simply went to bed and never woke up. But the survivors all described the same thing. Nightmares so terrifying. They were literally killing people. 3 years later, that newspaper story became the inspiration for one of cinema's most iconic villains, Freddy Krueger. Wes Craven, the director behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, didn't just wake up one day and decide to create Freddy Krueger. The inspiration came from multiple dark sources that haunted him throughout his life. First, there was Fred Krueger. Yeah, that's right. Fred with no D. A real kid who bullied Craven mercilessly at Wheaton High School in Ohio. This wasn't your typical schoolyard teasing. Krueger would wait for Craven after school, corner him in hallways, and make his life absolutely miserable. Craven never forgot this kid's name or the fear he felt. And decades later, he'd give it to his dream demon as a twisted form of revenge. But here's where it gets really creepy. In the early 1980s, Craven stumbled across a series of newspaper articles from the LA Times about Cambodian refugees who were literally dying in their sleep. These weren't isolated incidents. We're talking about healthy young men who would go to bed and just never wake up. The survivors spoke of horrific nightmares before each death. Doctors couldn't explain it. They called it Sudden Unexpected Death Syndrome, or SUDS. One article particularly stuck with Craven. It described a young man who was so terrified of sleeping that he'd stayed awake for days, downing coffee after coffee, turning all the lights on. His family finally convinced him to rest. He went to his room, and within hours, they heard screaming. They found him dead, with a look of absolute terror frozen on his face. Another inspiration came from Craven's own childhood trauma. He remembered being terrified as a child by a disfigured homeless man who lived in his Cleveland neighborhood. The man had severe burn scars covering his face, and young Craven would have nightmares about this man coming after him. That image of a burned face would haunt Craven's dreams for years. Armed with this nightmare fuel, Craven sat down to write what would become A Nightmare on Elm Street. But Freddy wasn't always the wisecracking, almost comedic villain we know from the later films. The original Freddy was pure, primal terror. Craven wanted to create something that violated our most basic need, sleep. He realized that unlike other horror villains who you could run from, hide from, or fight, Freddy was inescapable. Everyone has to sleep eventually. It was the perfect trap. The iconic glove came from Craven's deep dive into what scares us most. He researched primal fears and discovered that humans are instinctively terrified of claws and fangs, the weapons of predators. But he didn't want to make Freddy a werewolf or vampire. Instead, he created something worse. A predator with man-made claws, someone who chose to become a monster. The glove itself was crafted by Jim Doyle, and it was surprisingly simple, just a gardening glove with knives attached. But those knives weren't just for show. Craven insisted they be sharp enough to actually cut. And Robert Englund, who played Freddy, accidentally sliced himself multiple times during filming. But who was Freddy Krueger supposed to be within the world of the film? Craven crafted a backstory that was almost too dark for audiences to handle. Freddy's origin story begins with one of the most disturbing concepts in horror. His mother, Amanda Krueger, was a nun who worked at the Hathaway House, an asylum for the criminally insane. One Christmas Eve, she was accidentally locked in the asylum over the holiday weekend with 100 maniacs. When she was finally found, she had been brutally assaulted and was barely alive. 9 months later, she gave birth to Frederick Charles Krueger, literally the bastard son of 100 maniacs, as he would later call himself. This twisted conception was meant to explain Freddy's evil nature. He wasn't just a man who became a monster. He was born from violence and chaos. Amanda tried to raise him, but the trauma of his birth and her own suffering had broken her spirit. Freddy grew up knowing he was different, knowing he was unwanted, and that knowledge festered into something truly evil. As an adult, Frederick became a maintenance worker at the Badham Preschool. Yes, that's a reference to John Badham, who directed Dracula. For years, he lured children to the school's boiler room where he would torture and kill them. The kids called him the Springwood Slasher, and he murdered at least 20 children before parents started noticing their kids were disappearing. When Freddy was finally caught, the legal system failed spectacularly. A search warrant error, the police forgot to sign it, meant all the evidence was thrown out. Freddy walked free on a technicality, grinning as he left the courthouse. You can see this in the film when Nancy's mother, Marge, tells the story while holding up newspaper clippings with headlines like "Krueger Free" and "Lawyers Preschool Slasher." The parents of Elm Street couldn't let this stand. Led by Lieutenant Donald Thompson, Nancy's father, they formed a vigilante mob. They tracked Freddy down to 1428 Elm Street, to the very boiler room where he had killed their children. They doused the building with gasoline and burned him alive. Marge Thompson even kept his glove as a trophy, hiding it in their basement furnace. But death wasn't the end for Freddy. This is where Craven introduced the concept of dream demons, ancient evil entities that he only hinted at in the original film. These demons offered Freddy a deal: the power to return and hunt the children of those who killed him. Not in the real world, but in their dreams, where he was all-powerful and they were completely vulnerable. Originally, Craven wanted Freddy to be a child molester, not just a killer. He felt it would make the character more disturbing and the parents' revenge more justified. But New Line Cinema pushed back, worried about the sensitive subject matter, especially with real child abuse cases making headlines at the time. So they changed him to just a child killer. Though Craven always said the implications were still there beneath the surface, and later films would hint at this darker backstory. Finding the right actor to play Freddy was crucial, and Robert Englund almost didn't get the part. The role was originally offered to Kane Hodder, who later became famous as Jason Voorhees. But Englund's audition was so unsettling that Craven knew he'd found his demon. The makeup process was grueling. Englund had to sit in a chair for hours while makeup artist David Miller applied layer after layer of latex and burn scarring. The process was so hot and uncomfortable that Englund lost weight during filming just from sweating in the makeup. But here's what made Englund's performance legendary. He didn't just play Freddy as a monster, he gave him personality, dark humor, and a twisted charisma that made him almost likable. This wasn't in the original script. Englund improvised most of Freddy's one-liners and mannerisms. The voice was inspired by Englund's own childhood fears. He based Freddy's distinctive rasp on how he imagined his father would sound if he came home drunk and angry. It's a deeply personal performance wrapped in the guise of a supernatural killer. When A Nightmare on Elm Street hit theaters in 1984, it did something unprecedented. It made sleep itself scary. Parents reported that their kids were afraid to go to bed. Coffee sales actually increased in some areas because people were staying up later. But Freddy's impact went beyond just scaring audiences. He fundamentally changed how we think about horror villains. Unlike Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, who were largely silent and mysterious, Freddy was chatty, clever, and seemed to enjoy his work. He turned murder into performance art. The film launched New Line Cinema from a small art house distributor into a major studio. They even nicknamed it the house that Freddy built, because the franchise was so profitable. What's fascinating is how Freddy evolved from Craven's original vision. The sequels turned him into more of an anti-hero, someone audiences almost rooted for. Kids wore Freddy gloves for Halloween. He became a pop culture icon, appearing on everything from lunchboxes to MTV. Out of real nightmares and buried trauma, Wes Craven shaped a villain who's endured in our minds and in pop culture for over 4 decades, creeping around where we're most defenseless. So remember, whatever you do, don't fall asleep.